Yeah.
Hey, I don't. It did. You just like disappeared.
I'm still on. That's the thing that's weird. It's just, I guess it's
Yeah.
just.
Wait. What? Let me try doing it from my end. What source did you pick for that?
Okay, so I'll run you through it real quickly. So
Yeah.
I did scene one and scene two. Scene one I did,
Okay. Oh, display capture. Got it.
and then I can tell you the properties. I just did display. Yeah, that's it. Oh, is this better now? Hello, can you hear us? Sorry. Are we good now, Ishan?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, cool. Sounds good.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so awesome. Welcome, guys. I'll just summarize a bit of what Neeraj just saying when we were on mute, I guess. So basically, just we're just gonna sort of like run through some basics of cinematography, and sort of just equip. I mean, I guess they're just tools that will equip ourselves with, that allow you to watch a film. I guess just and know more about how decisions were made and um, you know what goes into what goes behind the scenes of everything that you're watching.
Yeah,
I guess. And
exactly.
then yeah, I mean obviously as I mentioned, just if you have any questions, thoughts, responses, just please put them in the live chat, and then we'll incorporate them into the conversation, and then we can just like get chatting more. So I'm just gonna start this.
Presentation, yeah. And I think the important thing for everyone to kind of just remember about all of the things that we're kind of saying is these are all like tools, and they're mix and match. You pull from them. Sometimes you use a certain shot creates a certain emotion traditionally, but then you can break from it to kind of do something different with it. So all of these are kind of like, these are all like rules that are meant to be broken in a way. So I think that's like a very important thing to remember. So yeah, so these are all just the tools that are kind of available to you that you can pick and choose from and combine in different ways. And at the end we're gonna like watch a scene and like also read the script of that scene, so we'll kind of have an idea of how they've like gone from the page to the screen. So yeah.
Yeah, should we get going?
Sounds good.
So I mean, I guess this is sort of just starting with like the different questions, right, that go into it, and I think the first thing is, like you mentioned, was just shot size, because that sort of is basically what you as a viewer see, right? And then that's sort of totally dictating all of the things that we're seeing as an audience. And then that also impacts how you receive the story and how you, what sort of emotions it's conveying as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I think, yeah. So like you can there's the wide spectrum of choices that you have, like the gradations in between that, from like a wide shot to an extreme close up, right? Like an extreme close up. So and all of these are just like kind of like how you're gonna show what's unfolding in front of you on the screen, right? So that's where I think things kind of differ from some of the other art forms, where it's not like a static frame, right? You can get closer, you can get further away, whether you do that physically by moving the camera closer or by changing the lens and getting a shot that's kind of tighter, so to speak, as you'd go towards a close-up. So we're just going to show you some like visual examples that kind of show you that range before we like, I think it just does a good job of kind of establishing like the vocabulary from which we'll be talking for the rest of the presentation. So yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. So this is like I would consider this like even beyond extreme wide, honestly, because it's so far away from the subject, but it kind of shows the landscape and all of that. So this to me is like almost like an extreme wide, but I mean, in terms of like how we'd use this, it's like for storytelling, it's more about the landscape, right, in this kind of a scene. So I think that's where it kind of turns into like it's about showing how big these clouds are in relationship to this. I guess you'd call it a motorcade in Mad Max. But yeah. Next slide, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, this would be like your extreme wide shot, like a more standard traditional extreme wide shot, right? Where you have the sense of the landscape, but then the person is still like relatively big enough in the foreground or in the foreground that you can kind of see them as an individual. And I think this is like a really good example of it. Yeah.
I mean, I think this is sort of similar to the other one as well, but just relative to the film, I think, which is what we were talking about
Yeah.
earlier, right? It's sort of just the scale of the film. This one works, like this one feels extremely wide,
Mm-hmm.
whereas I think relatively in sort of what's happening in Mad Max, that sort of is like the perfect extreme wide
Yeah.
shot that works.
Yeah. Also, I think it kind of, you kind of get that sense of like impending doom, I guess, or like whatever, like as he's going into this final climax sequence. So it's like, I think in that sense, it kind of captures that sense of like isolation that we would see in a scene like this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then, this is a more traditional wide in that sense. Also, like, I know this, I kind of picked all like shots that are related to landscapes, so might not have been the best idea, but also like have to remember that a wide shot very traditionally can be used in a simple interior location as well, right? Where you see all, like, say there's 4 characters in one shot, right? And you can see all 4 characters at once, and it's fairly wide. Something similar to like what we saw in like a lot of the sequences in High and Low, right? In that there was a lot of these wide shots where you have these ensembles at once. Yeah. So the next slide actually is cool. So this is what we call like a full shot, where you have like the feet to the head kind of taking the top to bottom of frame, right? So it's kind of like a hero shot in a way, and I think it has its place. I think it kind of it feels close enough to the subject while giving you enough sense of the landscape around him as well at the same time.
Yeah.
This is what we call like a medium wide. So medium wide traditionally would be like, I kind of, for like the purpose of my like explanation when I'm working with someone, is like I'll say it's like the thigh and above or somewhere around there. So like above the knees essentially.
Yeah.
It's a good way to like kind of it's a good way to like kind of start putting in like physical demarcations in terms of shot size. So like you can be like, okay, if we see the full body, it's a full shot. If we see from the knees above, it's going to be a medium wide. So that you and the director like try to be on the same page when you're like talking about these kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah, and then I mean we'll sort of see how that works in this next one.
Yeah. So then this is like the medium, right? And it's like kind of like the waist. It's like a very like a waist and a little bit of headroom, kind of gives you that medium shot. So I think a lot of movies tend to like live in the medium shot. It's like that's a very it's a shot that often ends up being used. It's probably depending on the director, obviously, but I think most directors use medium shots very frequently.
Yeah.
And then you can, punch in a little bit to a medium close-up, which I kind of think of as like a bust, of like a traditional bust in a sense. So it's like from the chest kind of with the head and a little bit of headroom usually. So this is a good example of that. And then you'd have a close-up, which is the next shot, which is, usually your face takes up the full screen. And a lot of directors tend to use this because this is like, a highlight on emotion in the actor's face, and ends up being used, quite frequently as well. So I think like, a lot of directors will tend to like do a wide shot to set up a scene, and then they'll quickly jump.
And like slowly go in.
Yeah, and then they'll quickly jump into your mediums and medium close-ups and stay in that range. And then depending on who the director is, they'll really use the close-up sparingly, sometimes, and some directors tend to use the close-up a lot. So it just depends. It's a very personal taste type of thing and a personal preference type of thing.
Yeah.
And then
I guess. I mean, we'll sort of see that soon.
yeah, and then you have like the extreme close-up, right, where you want to like focus in on a very specific part or a specific thing. So like, I mean, oftentimes it usually ends up being the eyes because they're expressive. But like it can be anything. It's very detailed, and this I think is used a little more, used a little more sparingly usually. It's
Yeah,
it,
but I mean, mean, what would be interesting is to sort of like understand just like I think the different ways in which it's used, right? Because it
Yeah.
conveys a lot of emotion, but like it can do it in like vastly different way.
No,
Whereas
absolutely.
I think this one is one particular way.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it's from yeah. So like in Skyfall, I think like you're sort of set in that world, right, of
Mm-hmm.
espionage and all that, and I think that really puts you in it, like gives that certain context, and then this sort of shot does a lot more in that sort of I don't know, I guess like just with that spy context, like you sort of
Mm-hmm.
it does the work for you, whereas in another one like it could convey
Yeah.
say like say a different sort of not the same tension, but
Mm-hmm.
just I guess
No, I think that's the thing.
that sort of
It's
like very internal
yeah, it's
like
all
emotion
about
that the character is feeling.
how you kind of use it, I think, and that's the thing. It's like, some directors use it very sparingly. Like I would almost say like, punctuation marks in a way. And that too, like the rare ones where it's like, I want you to pay attention to this, right? Because it's different from everything else. And then, other directors will use extreme close-ups rather frequently, kind of like keeping you close. And it almost starts to feel a little claustrophobic at times. And, it can create a different sense or different emotion just based on
Yeah,
how much you use any one of these tools for that matter, you
for
know?
sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's pretty much, and then,
Sorry.
yeah, actually, yeah, we can go to that. And then that's actually the last, like, another version of an extreme close up, which is often used for like a point of view shot or something of that nature, where it's like, the audience kind of you need to show a prop or something, right? So it's like a way to show an extreme close up and also kind of show someone kind of focusing in on a specific subject or
Detail also.
detail. Yeah, exactly. And so like this moment in Interstellar is like very like it's a very key moment in the film, and it's like honing in on the watch and how that kind of plays. Um, has an impact, and also is like it and the way he uses it is also it's kind of like a um it has its kind of it comes full circle because in the beginning of the film he gives his daughter the watch, and you don't really think about it at that time, but then at this moment by the extreme close-up it almost forces you to remember when he did give the watch,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
you
yeah,
might have forgotten that as a small detail, but if you like by doing the extreme close-up he's like pay attention to this.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, so that's pretty much it on like in terms of shot sizes. And I don't know if we have any questions at the moment or if
Not right, not that I can see, but
okay, cool.
just give me a second. Let me
No worries.
toggle that. Just like juggling the different
Mm-hmm.
screens.
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, no. So far, nothing on
Mm-hmm.
the questions.
Okay, no worries. That's
Um,
fine. So I think that's like the interesting thing about like cinematography in a sense is that the thing that keeps changing compared to like other art forms, say photography or say well, there's some similarities in photography, but painting and this and that, um, the relationship within a single scene or a single film can change between how far like the camera and the events that are unfolding in front of the camera. So,
mhm.
and I think it's like, a big part of the cinematographer's job is to like realize how do we tell the story effectively by using those tools that we have, the shots that we have. Um, so yeah, shall we just move on to the next section then?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so next we're talking about lens
Yeah, lens choices.
lens choice, right?
Yeah. And this is just like like I don't want to get too technical into it, but I kind of just want to explain to you how you get a wide shot and how you get an extreme close up and like what's kind of happening behind the behind the scenes kind of. So if we go to the next slide, you'll kind of see this graphic kind of explains to you like different focal lengths of lenses give different angle. They call it the angle of view. Sorry. So obviously the longer lens is what you'd call for like an extreme close up, right? Extreme close up is usually called a long lens, and then you'd call something that shows an extreme wide shot a wide lens, or sometimes I think they call it short lenses, but not as much anymore. So the biggest thing to remember about I've put these like 2 or 3 notes on the side. I think that's like a very important thing to consider is wide lenses tend to have a little more distortion because you're basically the screen size isn't getting wider or narrower. You're fitting more information into the same screen size, so you're kind of compressing you're compressing an image to fit within a certain frame size.
Right.
So that's what is like in a way what you could kind of put towards the idea of distortion, or a way to think about distortion, even though it's not exactly that, but it's a good way to start thinking about it.
That's a good way to sort of like it's an easier way to understand it.
Exactly. But the one thing that's interesting about wide lenses is that space tends to have more depth. So two subjects at the same distance with like a wide lens will feel further apart than two subjects at the same distance with the longer lens, and we'll see that in the next couple slides. We have a few examples of that.
So basically, like you're saying that like if two people are standing, say whatever,
Mm-hmm.
1 foot apart, and depending on what lens you choose, that 1 foot feels like more or less.
Yeah, exactly. You can, and that's like the interesting thing. You can do like a sort of like a manipulation of space in through the lens choice that you choose. The other thing to like always or kind of think about also with the wider lenses versus the telephoto lens is like a quality that a lot of people like talk about when it comes to cinema is like that the bokeh or the out of focus nature of an image, right? So when you see everything in focus, it's gonna tend to be a wider lens just because a wider lens sees more, and it just the way the mechanics of the glass work and the way the science of it all works, you see more depth of field. So say for example, there's like say I want to shoot a scene with two people at a certain distance, but I want both of them in focus, and say the 35 millimeter lens like we see here isn't getting both of them in focus for me because they're at two different distances from the camera. So maybe I can switch over to an 18 millimeter lens, and while it's wider, it might end up getting both of them in focus.
Right.
Um, and at the same exposure level. So that's it's like I don't want to get too technical, but I just want to kind of get into like what the emotion of it could be or what it could do from a storytelling standpoint. But I think like that's the thing to just remember. It's like the wider lenses tend to have more depth of field, and as you go more and more telephoto, the depth of field gets narrower and narrower. So for example, a certain lens, it can be like like say you get to like the 600 or 900 millimeter lenses, it might be so thin that if you focus on someone's nose, their eyes will be like slightly out of focus.
Right. Oh wow.
Like that thin. Like you're talking about inches at that point. So that's like I guess the main thing to kind of take away from that. And then I guess we can move into the next little bit.
I think this one is such a cool image, and like it represents it so well. Cause I think that's what I was saying earlier as well. When we were talking about it, because if on the face of it, they all look the same, right? Like if you're just looking at it briefly or like it's a quick glance, like they're almost the same. But then if you stop and like look at each one, then you really start seeing how the choice of lens affects what you're seeing in the image, right? And the more you look at it, you find, and I mean it's weird now. Like when I'm looking at it now, like they seem obviously different.
Yeah.
Right? But when I looked at it for the first time, I was like, okay, this is the same, like the exact same image of this guy.
Yeah.
So I think that was really cool.
Yeah. And I think that to that effect, the thing I was talking about, how a certain lens can create more like the increased sense of depth perception. I think you can see that with like the 20 millimeter lens, right? It looks like his nose is coming out a little further towards you, and his hair is going a little further back, or his shoulders are a bit further back. Whereas like by the time you move on to like say the 70 and onwards, it starts to feel a little bit like it just like come together. So like the nose and the hair are like kind of closer in line with each other. So I think there's a sweet spot, obviously, which I think every director, again, the sweet spot is different for everyone. But I think like the 50 is kind of a cool spot to
Yeah.
be, and like the somewhere between the 35 and the 50, because the 3D, like I guess it's all about um, how the face kind of renders through each lens. And so the important thing to remember about what this experiment is doing, however, is that while we're changing the focal length of the image, he has maintained the same size of the image, right? So it starts at the shoulders
Yeah.
and there's a little bit of headroom. And so what he's doing in this case is the 20 millimeter shot might be a foot away from the subject, or maybe a foot and a half away from the subject, while like as you move further away, the camera is moving
Yeah.
physically further away. So I think that's the other
Yeah.
important thing to
So I
consider.
mean, I think what would also have been cool is just to see that, like a diagram of that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like to see that this is sort of what the physical setup
Yeah.
was for the 20 millimeter shot, and then 24, 28,
Mm-hmm.
35, so on and so, like,
Yeah.
just it like keeps going back. I think
Right.
that would just like illustrate it really well in terms of like you're getting
Mm.
this consistent, or like the same frame.
Yeah. So this is
This is sort
all.
of the physical setup that you need to do to get that.
Yeah. So this is all very like it's all physics at the end of the day. So it's all very calculatable. So I think like I mean if you look, there's like lens charts, right? So they'll tell you the angle of view, like the horizontal angle of view and vertical angle of view, right? So you can use that like math to say like if I want like 2 feet horizontal angle of view, or sorry, 2 feet horizontally, this is my angle of view with a 20 millimeter lens, and I'll get that same like 2 feet,
Yeah.
versus if I use a 150 millimeter lens or a 200 millimeter lens, to get that 2 feet, this is how far I need to be. And it's all like, there's so many like lens charts and tables that are published that kind of explain
Yeah.
all of those little pieces of information. It's the more technical side
I
of
mean,
things.
just as an aside, I think I remember when like we went to a photo exhibit, and then I think it was who was the guy? I can't. It was like these like really intimate like portraits
The ones in
of
Japan?
yeah.
Yeah, Christopher
Uh,
Anderson.
yes, and then I remember like I think you spoke to him, and then we found out that they were actually like really long um, lenses, and he wasn't actually anywhere near his
Mm-hmm.
subjects.
Yeah.
Right, and that was like super fascinating just
Mm-hmm.
to see how like what you're seeing as a viewer in the photographs in this case, and then what the actual sort of scenario of setting that up, and like that moment where he captured those images.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I remember this. He uses like for that entire series. I think he used like a 600 millimeter lens.
Mm,
So with a 600 millimeter lens and like the size of the frame, it was like I mean he did these like even tighter than these images, for example.
yeah,
Um, I mean he must have been a solid like at least 40, 50, if not 75 feet away.
yeah. So I
But
mean, like conceivably, like whoever was in the photograph, like wouldn't necessarily know,
oh no,
right?
absolutely,
Like
probably
it's
not.
totally possible. Yeah,
Yeah.
which is wild.
But I mean, but the shots and the moments feel so intimate, and I think that's what's like amazing thing about that. And if any of you want to like go look him up, he's on like Instagram and online and everywhere, and he has like an
Yeah,
amazing
we
body
can
of
share
work.
some of those on the Telegram group, and then
Yeah,
maybe on Instagram as well.
yeah.
Should we go? Whoa,
There should be a
sorry.
video.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, cool. So this is gonna kind of We're gonna walk you through like the idea of using a wide lens and how a wide lens creates depth. So when we play this clip, just pay attention to like Leonardo DiCaprio's character and then his wife and child and the tree in the background, and how far apart he feels and how removed he feels from them in this like dream sequence, memory sequence of sorts. So if you want to go ahead and play that.
Yep.
So yeah, I think it does a good job of kind of removing him from the scene in a way where he feels kind
I
of
mean, it
distant.
just feels so spaced out.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Like it's just like I mean, I'll just play again once more, just but like even the distance here, like if you can see
Yeah.
my cursor, but it's like from these two in the like
Yeah.
I guess, background, and then when he's walking up, like, just seems all three of them seem so far away.
Yeah, and
You know,
and
it's
there's
not
that
even
distortion.
just yeah, yeah, exactly. So I guess that, but that I guess that also adds to the sort of like dreaminess or like dream aspect of this scene, right?
No, exactly. Yeah.
Which is super cool.
Mm-hmm.
Should we move to the next?
Yeah. So this is an incredible scene from Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and when we play it, you'll see how it kind of works. He's using a 2000 millimeter lens, which is like extremely long, but what it does, and you'll see how it compresses space. So these two characters are able to have an entire conversation for about 45 seconds while this.
Let's
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I think just seeing it
Yeah.
has such an impact.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, I mean, even if you've seen the film, I think I guess you just like realize how like fascinating it is once you know, like how what's gone into building it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna play it now. Right, there we go.
And so there's no audio, but I mean, the plane appears so close to them in a sense, and the space feels so compressed, and the plane keeps coming closer and closer and closer, and you're like, it's gonna hit them. There's no way it's not. But then, you know, as the scene kind of finishes up, you see how like that space kind of was compressed and how,
Yeah,
you know,
and that in fact it wasn't close to them at all.
yeah, exactly. So I think that's like a great example of showing you like the extreme ends of what like a lens decision can do in terms of how you use a space. And for example, if you want to just like quickly play like a part of that again,
Yeah.
uh, going back to our shot size, this is a medium wide shot, right? But you're using a 2000 millimeter lens. So I think that's like the interesting thing because a lot of people think like, oh, if you use a longer, like a tighter lens, it's going to be like an extreme close up, but it doesn't have to be. You just create that distance between you and the subject with a 2000 millimeter lens. So say they're like, you know, I don't know how long the distance would be like, but whatever, the camera might be 100 yards away from them or whatever.
Right. And then you sort of like place the three things out, right? Like
exactly.
Camera, the two characters, so that you get that like medium wide shot, and then the plane, which is like off, I guess, off my camera, but like the plane's coming in.
Yeah.
And then you sort of like map out the distance, like you were saying, because you can sort of calculate all of these things.
Exactly. So yeah, that's the thing. It's like, you know, traditionally, yes, a 2000 millimeter lens will be used for a very specific purpose. But I think that's where it's like an interesting example of breaking the rules to kind of like be like, okay, we can use a 2000 millimeter lens because it has this like, you know, compression of space and use that to tell this part of the story. So I think that's like a great example of how things have been repurposed in terms of cinematography. Next slide. So now we're going to start talking about like camera positions and like where the camera can be placed within a scene, right? I think that kind of starts.
I mean, I think this is sort of the perfect like segue from what we were discussing, right?
Yeah.
Because I think we're sort of talking about just like sort of just the choice of shot, and then like what lens you'd use to sort of facilitate that, and then now is obviously how you yourself as a camera operator or like a director who's deciding what the camera should see, like the choices in terms of like how you would position.
Exactly.
Cool.
So moving into it.
So I guess similarly, we'll just run through images and examples. I think of films that a lot of people might have seen, so that just it sort of makes sense, and sort of the images that you've already might be aware of. So like it sort of just like puts into context with this sort of like vocabulary.
So yeah, first up we have like this, you know, low angle shot. I think the one on the left with Inglorious Bastards is a very traditional low angle shot, right? It's like almost like if you were on the ground looking up, and it kind of establishes their power over. I think they're like torturing one of the Nazi characters in the film, so it kind of establishes that, you know, sense of power and, you know, them looking down on him. obviously all of this has to like eventually do with the last bit of things that we're going to talk about, which is blocking and where the characters are in relation to each other and like what makes sense for where the camera would be. But I think like at a very like subliminal or at a very like subconscious level, it has that kind of emotion behind it. Um, and I think like and there's the Ozu shot. Like obviously we've like seen a lot of Ozu's films. You have the Tatami shot, and I think he uses low angles in a different way, right? It's not like a low angle looking up. It's just a low angle,
Yeah.
and kind of just the camera stays low. And I think he uses it basically so that he can have his characters, sit, stand, walk through a frame, and it kind of creates
Yeah.
like
I think.
that
I mean,
sense of
I think
movement.
that they're just a lot more neutral,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Exactly.
Like I think these are just like two great examples because they show you sort of the wide gamut of what you can do with
Mm-hmm.
like a low angle shot. Just because I mean, I think the Inglorious Bastards one is
It's
it
about
makes you feel a certain way,
yeah.
right? Whereas this one sort of like you're just observing
Mm-hmm.
the characters moving in and out, which I think
Yeah.
is sort of just two ends of the spectrum, and it just sort of gives you like a great idea of what's possible.
Exactly. So yeah, next slide. So this is like, just a very traditional eye level shot. And oftentimes like a director or a cinematographer will tend, for the most part, you tend to stay eye level. And, some cinematographers and directors tend to like staying like, maybe 6 inches below eye level, right? Just a tiny bit below eye level. But that's like, and I think the majority of your scenes end up playing out in that space, right? Kind of like with your character, you're seeing them, straight ahead in front of you. So I think that's like a very traditional, very common. It has commonplace. I think in terms of like the language of you know cinematography. Um, if you want to quickly just go back to the last one real quick, I think we can like point out another thing. But here, they've used this relatively wide lens, but they've chosen to stay with like a shallower depth of field so that the character in the background kind of feels distant, and it's
Yeah,
almost
yeah,
like
yeah.
she's dazing, like in a daze, or like kind of like
Mm-hmm.
zoning
Sort of just
out.
like zoning out. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
exactly.
And that's the amazing thing is like we don't need, like, for anyone who hasn't seen this film, I think we all can like kind of pull that emotion from this image, and I think that's like
Yeah,
amazing, right? You don't have to necessarily know the context of everything, because the image can tell you so much. Okay, cool. So that was all
yeah,
about that one.
absolutely.
um, so our next slide, this is like kind of that low angle, or sorry, a high angle looking down type of a shot. And this obviously has to do with the story, with the aliens kind of coming in, but it almost also makes them feel powerless, or like, they've lost all hope, kind of looking down on them, right? It's like about the power dynamics of looking up versus looking down. Um, this would kind of be the reverse shot of what we saw with like Inglorious Bastards, for example. Um, Yeah. So this is like this is similar to the last one, but then I consider this more of like a bird's eye shot because you're looking like almost perpendicular to the ground, right? Looking straight down.
Yeah.
And to me, like there's a certain omniscient feeling that comes with this. And if you've seen the
Mm-hmm.
film, it's like a very
Yeah.
apt time to use a shot like this and a visual like this,
Yeah.
in Blade Runner
I mean,
2049.
I think it also just like conveys so much,
Mm-hmm.
just in that like I guess just this one moment, which I think is I mean obviously that goes for all the images and that we've shared, but I think it just in particular some of them just like work sort of even better,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Exactly. Um,
Um, cool, next, just
yeah. So this
an
is a
interesting one.
Yeah, this is a film I've not actually seen, but I think 12 Monkeys, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
but this is what we call a canted angle. So actually, everything else, the camera's been level to the ground, but in this, you've kind of used a roll, basically, what you would call it in terms of like physics, I guess, or whatever, where the camera is kind of tilted, so your horizon has shifted, right? Your
Mm.
The horizon is starting at the left and like angling down to the right. So that kind of creates a sense of like unsettled, you know, nature, it feels a little off-putting. Another movie where they use this a lot was in Thor, the first film, and so it's like a good like reference point in case anyone wants to like, kind of see how it was used. I mean, I think that's like a good example of where it was used. So like, and it's very like, and they use it very liberally. So I think it's like a place where you can kind of start to think about why they chose where they used it,
Mm-hmm.
in relation to the rest of the film. So this is now this kind of has to do with like a few different things. So this is obviously like we said earlier, this is like a medium, medium close up, medium shot. Kind of falls into eye level, but now we're adding in a third element with this, which I would say is that it's over the shoulder. So between two characters. So when you have two characters like this, you can kind of choose where you want your camera to be, right? Your camera can be inside the two characters in terms of like their relationship. So if these are the two characters and your camera's in here and here, you can see them without the other one's presence. But you can put the camera outside the two characters, and then you can have a sense
Both of
of,
them.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you can, and in this you can kind of see that like even with the choice of lenses, they feel fairly close together. And I think I mean, from the story perspective too, this moment, if you remember,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what I was saying when we were talking about this is just that you feel that sort of like privateness of this conversation,
mhm,
right? Because I think in the film this was a fairly significant moment, right, where he's trying to convince him, um, you know, that he needs to do. I forget specifically what it was, but like this is like one of the moments where he's like trying to convince him, right?
mhm,
And then you feel that just from this image, right? And
exactly,
just from the way this is set up, that like it's sort of quiet, like you can see that it's like at a like cocktail bar or like some lounge, and
mhm,
then they're like sort of they're like in a public space, but there's other people around, but they're sort of coming together to like leaning in almost.
exactly, yeah. So I think like that's like the interesting thing about over the shoulder shots. I think you have to like, um, and I think it's like sometimes people don't think about them. Sometimes people just want to tell the story, right? But I think if you choose to do some shots like over the shoulder versus, some shots, as they say in the like when we're shooting and stuff, like clean. So
Mm,
so in the film world there's like a lot of jargon, but in this kind of a shot we would say that the character on the right is dirtying the frame.
right.
So that's what, instead of over the shoulder, you'd say like, oh, should we have that character dirty the frame? Something like that. So it's like in the
Mm,
foreground, just kind of out of focus. And then, a clean shot would be just like straight up. So I think that's
yeah.
kind of,
And
um,
I think we'll see an example of it towards
mhm,
the end,
yeah,
which I think will illustrate it really nicely.
exactly.
And then the next one, oh, this one's a great. This is a great one.
Yeah. So with King's Speech, a lot of, they used a lot of POVs in this film, if I remember correctly. And it was like to kind of create that sense of anxiety he feels every time he has to speak.
Yeah,
And so I think a shot like this does a great job of kind of showing that. It's like a POV shot, which is like his exact perspective of what he's seeing. You have everyone staring into the lens, and then you
yeah,
have like the microphone kind of framing the whole thing. So I mean, I think POV shots are something that get used. Depends some frequently, but like I wouldn't say they're used extremely frequently. I think it's still like
hmm,
relatively low on the ladder in terms of like things. Because the other thing that happens with POV shots often is that you'll have the other subject staring into the camera, which we call
right,
breaking the fourth wall. So do you
yeah,
want to, the question is, do you want to break the fourth wall or not? And then,
right,
does that work emotionally for the scene, like the tone of the film?
hmm,
Um, so yeah, and then the next shot. So this is great because this is kind of similar to the previous, like the over the shoulder. This is also about like the relationship between two characters, and so we call this a two shot where you have the two characters kind of, I mean, not necessarily always in profile, but usually will be in profile in a two shot. You kind of have them at in the two frames you see they're at differing distances from each other, but it's a very confrontational angle, right? It's like, you know, A
Yeah.
versus B, B versus A. So it kind of creates that sense of emotion. I think even our next shot does the same thing. Yeah. So same thing. Um, I think also like what this shot does differently than some of the other shots we've done is you can like just see the headroom. So it kind of creates the and in how they frame them within the windows, and you know you can start to like look at different parts of an image. You know, as you start to
Mm-hmm.
think about these things. Also, we're like a little bit distanced from them, I feel. So it's like you
Yeah.
know, so
Yeah. Yeah.
it's and that's the thing. It's like when watching a movie, I don't know. Sometimes I'm like, do we need to really think about all of these things? Um, and sometimes the answer is no, but sometimes you notice it, and I think that's like really cool too, right? Like I
Yeah.
I was just
I mean,
watching this
I think,
movie.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think a lot of times, like all of this work that goes into it happens very, like for a viewer, it's very subconscious, right? Like
Hmm.
you're not sort of seeing it explicitly in that sense. And I feel like the ones that the films that are most successful do that really well.
Yeah.
Is that they put all of these tools and like techniques together and set them up in a way that, you know, what you're really focusing on is what maybe stuff we were talking about last week, right? Which is the stakes that the character is sort of dealing with, and like all of those sort of elements, right? And then all of this is sort of keeping you engaged and like locked into the story and just like everything that's happening.
Hmm. Yeah, no, a lot of like you know, a lot of like filmmakers in general, like not even just directors, but across the board with like cinematographers, production designers, and you know, musicians and everything. You know, I think one thing we always kind of keep saying is it comes back to the story. It like, you know, at the end of the day, everything we kind of do has to come back and fit the story. It can't be like, oh, we
Yeah,
want to just go make a pretty shot, so let's go figure out how to make a pretty shot, because then you
yeah.
might as well just be going and shooting like stock footage or like you know
Mm-hmm.
whatever. It's about you know very
But yeah, but also like
specifically.
what is that pretty shot doing for my film, right? Like
Exactly. Hmm.
how is it keeping the story alive, keeping the story going, and how's it keeping the viewer
Yeah,
hooked, not, you know, just like captivated by it.
exactly. And that's not to say like movies are not beautiful. Like I mean, look at a movie like Blade Runner 2049. It's extremely beautiful,
Yeah,
but every single decision, from a lighting decision to a you know, a lensing decision, it all comes from the story. Like I remember there was this interview where Deacon says that even the moving sunlight inside the mansion, I guess it is, or the
mm,
office, or whatever you want
yeah,
to call it, um, that all came from the idea that this guy who's, you know, in this really grim world, he still wants to feel the sunlight, and he's created sources of sunlight that replicate sunlight for
right,
him, you know?
yeah, yeah.
Things like
Oh wow,
that. I
that,
mean,
yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I really want to watch that film again. Like it's been a while since I've seen it, but it was
mhm.
just like I think it was a perfect like second film to such a wildly respected
Yeah,
artist, you know,
exactly.
and especially like after so many years.
Right, right, right. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that's like the important thing. I think it's not like we're saying. I'm trying to say like, oh, aesthetics don't matter. I think aesthetics do matter, but I think if they stem from the
Yeah,
story, they are even that much
of
better.
course. Yeah, I mean, I think like it's basically just like how form and function like work together, and when they come together like perfectly, when
Hmm.
it's, you know, that's when I think it's most effective. Because if you, I mean,
Exactly.
you can have form only, and you can have like function only, and then sort of they're two parallels. But I think when they meet is like when you sort of like have that,
Hmm.
like those magic moments.
Exactly. So I think that's the last slide for this section that we have. Do we have any
Yeah,
questions or
doing
anything?
camera movement. I think we can just keep going, and then
Do
I'll
questions at the
pause
end?
when we have stuff.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay, cool, cool.
yeah,
So now that we've kind of established like you know the shot sizes, the camera placement, now like you know obviously a lot of what we see in films is the camera moves, um, and so you know these are a few of the different tools we have for camera movement that we'll kind of like quickly just go through, um, and so we'll start with like the most simple, like right, if you're on a tripod, you have you know pan and tilt, and then you have a static locked off shot. So I think if we want to start with those, and then we
yeah.
can kind of keep going. So a pan really involves like the camera staying on one physical point and then rotating left or right, so to speak. So
Yeah. So it's
you,
basically just like you sort of
yeah,
just like do that, right?
it's like a
Making
pivot.
a
If you
very
were to pivot,
crude example. Yeah.
yeah. So what that allows, it's kind of like it has a reveal. It has a sense of reveal in
Hmm.
the left right axis, so to speak. If you were
Right.
if you were to draw like a flat circle on the ground, and point in one
Hmm.
like kind of like a compass.
Yeah.
That's a good way
Yeah.
to think
Yeah.
of it. So yeah, if you want to
Oh,
go to tilt. So tilt is different. Tilt is like kind of like if you were to like, I mean, tilt's pretty self-explanatory, right? Up to down. I think this is a cool shot because also like you're kind of giving him a hero's entry. So like the door opens, it starts on his feet, and then it kind of comes up to his face.
yeah.
And here we're kind of like below the eye level too. Remember, like kind of combining that previous
Like a
idea
little.
that
Yeah.
we kind of just talked about. We're at his waist level looking up. And so the tilt kind of has a lot more value as opposed to if you were at his eye level looking at his feet and then looking up. I think that's
For
like
sure.
that can be like a different story almost.
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
then this one is.
this is the locked off shot. So like kind of like
Oh
from
yeah.
Tokyo
Yeah.
Story, what we saw this film a few weeks ago now. But if we play
Right.
through,
So.
yeah, no worries. So this is like a locked off shot, and sometimes you'll do this where let the characters kind of come and go. So you're not really panning, you're not tilting, you're not trying to kind of do anything. And sometimes this also has place. So yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
pretty
I mean, I think.
self-explanatory.
Yeah. I mean, it just goes back to what we were saying. It sort of just lets you. You're just like neutrally sort of viewing what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't feel like the presence of the camera kind of becomes invisible and it becomes like this is
Yeah.
what's unfolding in front of me. I think that's like very like reminiscent of like stage, for example, right? Like theater.
Hmm. Yeah. Absolutely.
So yeah.
And then this one.
So this is the tracking shot. So before we
Yeah.
play it,
Yeah. Yeah.
a little bit different from uh, panning. I think the best way to think of it is like say you're in a train and looking out the window and you see things moving left to
Yeah.
right. So I think that's like a good way to think of it in terms of like relation between camera and subject. Now we can play it and kind of like show them how that kind of plays out. So it's a different I mean with Grand Budapest Hotel and with Wes Anderson he does it in a very specific way, but I mean tracking shots can be even used to say, person walking down the sidewalk,
Hmm.
let's stay with them in a tracking shot. I think they did
Yeah.
this a
Yeah.
lot in Roma, for example. A lot of tracking
Mm.
shots in Roma.
Is the I'm forgetting? Is the next one a different shot or is it a
No, the
specific?
next one will be a dolly in. So this is
Oh
a
yeah.
little bit different. Instead of tracking left right, we're going to move into the scene or into the space, or away from the space. But with this example, you kind of see it goes from a medium wide shot into a medium close up. And so you go from
Right.
like seeing the space and this moment, and you kind of slowly push into this, you know, the expression and this sense of it creates this heightened sense of emotion. And obviously the person who uses this the most is like Spielberg. um,
I mean, I think the emotion here is similar to sort of that like tilt shot, right?
mm-hmm,
Because there is that like reveal, but it's sort of like taking you to a moment,
mm-hmm,
which sort of happens here as well in a similar way. I'll just
yeah,
play the scene.
yeah, if you want to play it a second time,
It
yeah.
ends kind of yeah, it ends kind of abruptly.
Mm-hmm. And that's the interesting thing too. You can also notice like there's a certain amount of speed that's also used in that shot in terms of how
Yeah.
quickly he zooms, like pushes in. A slow push in versus a certain faster push in
Does
has
it get gradually? Does it gradually get faster? It feels like
um
maybe that's
it could be, but it could also be that be, when you do a push in, because you're getting closer to your subject, um, the way the lens kind of handles um,
oh, okay.
motion through a
Just the information.
space. Yeah. So like that's the other thing. Wide lenses sorry, wide lenses handle push-ins a little more dramatically, and longer lenses handle lateral movements like your tracking shots a little
Okay.
more dramatically. So depending on how emphasized you want the motion to feel, you can use
Yeah.
a longer lens or a wider lens to do a push in or a tracking shot.
Oh wow.
And so all of these things kind of factor. It's like it's a very delicate like dance, I guess, of like all these
Yeah.
pieces.
I mean, there's so many like different variables that like fall into it.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Exactly. Yeah.
So then we've got this one.
Okay, so this is a booming shot. In the way it's used in this shot is like very like I think it's very smart in terms of like doing a reveal, but like more often than not, it's also just used for like say a character's sitting down and stands up and you want to stay eye level with them at both points, right? So you'll literally find like there's different mechanisms to do this, but basically you're raising the camera up or down.
Right.
So if you want to go ahead and
Should we
play
just-
it,
Yeah. And then I had a few questions which I think like about this specifically, so we can talk about that.
sounds good. So yeah. So you're in their conversation, you're staying with them, and then as he kind of
Yeah.
I forget what exactly he's saying at this moment, but then there's like obviously this reveal, right? You go down to the feet, and by staying, you're kind of connecting them too, right? Because you could have done
Yeah.
the shot up top and then the shot down below the floorboards
Separate, yeah.
as separate shots, but by connecting them, you feel that he's connected to her and the
Yeah,
family,
exactly. So, I mean, you're sort of just like setting up that relationship.
and you don't know.
The two.
And you don't
Yeah,
know at this
exactly.
point, so it kind
I
of
mean, I
builds
think-
that tension.
Yeah, exactly. I
The
mean,
slow
this
creep.
is such a great scene, like we were talking about. But I think, I mean, just the question I had is like, how is this physically set up? Like, it's just like open on this side.
Yeah,
And
so
then,
in
like,
front of the camera, it's probably just open. I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but there's a very, very high chance that this was kind of just shot on a stage,
right,
so in a studio. And so when they were
Right.
to do that, they have panels that you can like pull away, and it's all just carpentry,
Right.
right? So you have carpenters on
Exactly.
set so that you can
yeah.
just
So this it's like so you're seeing sort of like this like elevation.
yeah,
If you
yeah.
were to walk in and then the camera sort of like going up to down. I mean, it's just so simple, but like incredibly powerful. Like you were saying, just to put the two sort of just like relate the three characters
Mm-hmm.
together.
Exactly.
Um,
And
I
it's
mean, I think we should definitely do that. Whereas Toma, I just look at this scene maybe a couple weeks later, once we go through some more of the different aspects, other than cinematography, and just like how this scene sort of like really takes all of the different moving parts that go into making a film, and like just executes them all so well. So like
Mhm.
acting, blocking, like
exactly.
all of that stuff.
Also, like the other
So
thing that's
so simple. Sorry, it's like so simple and so effective.
yeah.
Sorry, what were you saying?
No, I was saying the other thing that's really kind of interesting about this scene as a whole is that the film is not about this man and Christoph Waltz's character. It's about the
Right.
girl who's in the floorboards.
Yeah.
So it's such an interesting way to reveal that moment where you get to that character. Because if you just cut to it, I feel like they'd feel too disjointed in a way.
Yeah.
And then you'd be like, oh, I thought the film was about these guys, but because of that connection, it's kind of like the film starts here, but it's not about him, it's about her,
Right.
and it just moves along. So I thought that was kind of very cool. So yeah, I think we can move along with the next shot. So this is the use of handheld camera motion, and handheld, so you just kind of put it on your shoulder and you have your grips. Important thing to remember about handheld is that obviously you're going to feel the human touch, you're going to feel the presence of the
Cameraman.
of the cameraman.
Camera operator. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think what's going to happen that's very tricky is that each scene kind of has its own like not, I wouldn't say rhythm, but it has like a certain like amount of motion or kinetic energy that it needs. And so I think that's like the thing that the camera operator is going to be able to control by having the camera on his shoulder.
Mm.
So in this sequence, you'll kind of see it, when we play it, and I'll kind of just speak over it, I guess.
Yeah, cool. I'll
Um,
just cue it up now.
yeah. So like these opening shots, it's pretty, he's trying to keep it very like constrained. You're not really feeling his footsteps or anything. It's very subtle. And then you'll see this moment where it kind of changes, where I think it's this next shot. She runs and you kind of start to feel that energy, and he gets closer and you feel that,
That's sort of like,
and how he's walking now in this shot. So you have those like, I think you can, there's a third element now, right? It's like the kinetic energy of the scene, like we talked about with the dolly in and the slow push in, and I think it's like a similar thing that applies with this kind of a thing too, where it's like, and I think that's very instinctual, right? Like a cinematographer or camera operator with the camera on his shoulder, in that moment, it's kind of like that's what feels right, and you just kind of have to commit to it, because that's the other thing that's very like strange about being an operator, especially, is that once you can't make a half a decision. You have to like kind of be like, okay, this is the motion, and I'm going to complete it, or I'm not going to complete it, right? Or I'm going to stay with this character,
exactly.
because half decisions kind of get you nowhere.
But also I think that's an interesting point, just because like the half decision sort of is its own decision, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Because like if you're debating between, do I stand still or do I like make this movement,
Mm-hmm.
and then you sort of like do a half movement, you sort of like have this like stutter almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is kind of, at least from the viewer, is a decision that's been made.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, you're right. But I think it's just like from an aesthetic standpoint, or like from a storytelling standpoint, is it right for what you're trying to tell in that moment, is the larger question, I think.
Exactly.
So yeah.
And then there's this one.
So this is the opposite end of it, right? So this is Steadicam. I think that Steadicam is used. It's used a good amount these days. And I think what it allows you to.
Should I cue it up?
Yeah, it's a longer scene, so yeah, it's a longer scene.
But I think it's worth seeing the whole thing, so we can just like
100%.
a little over it. Right.
Yeah. So Steadicam. Oh,
What?
I think it went to the next page.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No worries.
All right, there we go.
So Steadicam is kind of like this floating camera of sorts, right? So kind of separate from handheld. You don't feel the operator's presence. The camera's kind of just going through a space. And, Steadicam is not, the cool thing about Steadicam or handheld compared to some of the other things, it's not tied down to like heavy equipment that's like limited to like a specific space, right? Like normally if you were on a dolly or something else, you wouldn't be able to go downstairs and all of that. But handheld or Steadicam, you can. And so what you'll kind of see is that he's going through these tight spaces, kind of following these characters as they enter this club, and just to set up the film, I think it does a good job of kind of taking you through all these spaces, kind of explains who these characters are and the world you're in, but it does it from this like kind of I think you use this word, like an omniscient viewpoint, which I think is like really interesting.
But I mean, I think what's interesting is what we were discussing earlier as well, is that when you compare Steadicam versus handheld, right? Like handheld is the more sort of natural technique.
Yeah.
Right. Where it's sort of like you're getting the natural movements and sort of like organic movements of the camera operator as well.
Yeah.
And Steadicam is sort of this like technical, like it's not, it's sort of it's like a created sort of technique. But what's weird is that when you're actually like seeing it as a viewer, they kind of switch, right?
Yeah.
Steadicam sort of feels like how you would see it if you were actually following them along.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like if I'm following, like if we do the same scene handheld versus Steadicam, and I'm watching back the handheld one, like there'll be all of the like the shakes and moves, like when I'm going down the stairs and all of those things, but like my eyes don't see them.
Exactly.
Right? Like when I'm actually doing it. So I think that's something that's like a really cool. I mean, it's just like a cool thing.
Yeah. 100%.
Like I don't really know how else to articulate it, but.
No, you're right. I think our perception, like our eyes kind of do the stabilization in our
Exactly.
heads or whatever, that when you're focusing in on how you see the world and how we perceive the world, we don't see the bumps of our footsteps and the motions or the vibrations of, you know, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, 100%. I think I get exactly what you're saying. And I think like Steadicam kind of and handheld have like an interesting relation in that sense, because handheld kind of has that human touch and that kind of imperfection, whereas Steadicam
Yeah.
has like kind of, it's more closer to reality in terms of how we see the world,
Yeah.
in terms of how we go through spaces. Also, like
I mean, I think
another,
this. Yeah. Sorry.
sorry, another great example of like kind of, I mean, I think they use the differences sparingly, but I think a good example obviously is like 1917, where they use like extensive Steadicam and kind of like walk through all these spaces, and you know, you see how it's used in a very like interesting way. Hello? Ishan, I think you're muted.
Sorry, my headphone died. So
Oh, okay, no worries.
what were you saying?
No, I was saying like 1917 is like another good example to kind of see how they used like Steadicam and handheld and like
Yeah.
camera
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
movement in general. It's like a good study on camera movement.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that like does such a great job of that sort of like following along in that like
Mm-hmm.
tight angle that you just like feel incredibly claustrophobic.
Absolutely. Also, like I
You know,
think,
especially when they're in the trenches.
yeah, I think that plus I think it's like also like interesting to consider like when they chose to stay behind the cameras or when they chose to stay in front of the cam or front behind the characters, in front of the characters, right?
Yeah.
Or like laterally, or you know, any of those little like things, you know, how they like chose to play with the actors and the blocking, and then the camera movement and how it kind of also fits in as a third character, I would say.
Yeah. Absolutely.
The next shot we have, however, moving along, is a crane shot. So crane is like, just as you imagine, it's, you know, camera can be really high up and it can come really low. I think what this shot does very well, and we'll play it a couple times, I think, because it's a very interesting one, is it combines like 4 or 5 of these elements into one, you know, fluid shot.
Yeah.
And I think what the like that's the beauty of it, right? It's like what you could have told in these broken, disjointed shots, by putting them together, um, I think has a certain value to it. And I think we spoke about this a few weeks ago, maybe I don't remember when, but like I was talking about like editing, and I think like I was like mentioning how this one cinematographer said that, you know, every time you make an edit, you're asking the audience to like take a break and reinvest in the reality of the film, right? I think I mentioned something along those
Yeah.
lines.
Yeah.
I think like this is kind of a really interesting example, because it's like by combining it all, you kind of, you don't have that moment of relief. You're kind of just like with them the whole
You're just
time.
in it. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, should we just dive
Yeah.
into it, because I think it like
Mm-hmm.
it's such a great one.
So you start with this crane shot. You're looking down, so you feel that sense of like danger. He's gonna fall, right? If the guy like let's go or whatever, and then you kind of come to eye level. So now you're on the same plane with both of them, and now you're in a 50-50, because the camera's, you know, has both of them kind of equal value. And then you come around as that sense of danger increases, and he's kind of, you know, he has this increased
Yeah.
power over him, and then you kind of see the people in the background, like his friends
And
and
it
the other
sort of ends
prisoners.
in a over the shoulder, right?
Exactly, it ends in an over the shoulder. And I think after this point they cut back and forth into like the
Yeah.
over the shoulder back and forth, but just to set up the scene with the, you know, the sense of danger, the way the camera kind of comes around, it kind
I
of,
mean, I think it just like very quickly in whatever, like maybe like 15 seconds gives you so much of the context,
exactly.
you know, without doing a lot. I mean, I think it just like it does it so economically that
I mean,
it just like works.
look, we're seeing the film without any audio, any story context. A lot of these scenes, and yeah, some of these
Yeah.
films that we've seen obviously a couple times or whatever. But at the same time, I think you don't remember every scene. But I think just by like the visuals, like I can remember what these scenes are about, or like what the dynamics of these scenes were between these characters. I think that's what's fascinating. Um,
Absolutely.
Cool. So I think we can cut to the next one. So now, okay, cool. So now that we've talked about like all things kind of camera and lens related, there's another part of cinematography which is like light and color. I think that's like a very important thing that we couldn't like ignore. I mean, obviously there's a lot to talk about with light and color between like hard light, soft light. You
So
know,
I think we'll just do like a
yeah, we'll just touch upon some of
get a
these
quick
things.
idea about what that is. Maybe that's something that we can, maybe in a second like follow up session we could do light
Expand.
and cut. Yeah,
But
maybe we can figure that out later. But
we'll
I
start
guess
talking about it.
yeah,
So I think like just to start thinking about things visually, I think the important thing to think about is like low key lighting versus high key lighting. That's like one thing we'll talk about. Then the next thing we'll talk about is like the use of contrast. So whether you use high contrast in like silhouettes or like low contrast, and how like cinematographers kind of create that with like the directionality of the light, I think is an important point of that. And then the third thing that I'd really like kind of talk about is color contrast, which is something that you can do through design or through the lighting. And we'll see both examples. And then, I think the important thing to remember is like kind of the old way of kind of doing like filmmaking and stuff was like, lighting for a very specific shot, right? So your characters are going to be in this position, and then at this moment they're going to move to this position. And I think the reason was because of the technology. I think, they're like with film, you had to use a lot more light. And so you had to light a very specific spot on a set for the actor to be in, which would be, I mean, I'm sure you've heard the phrase like finding your light, right? So it's like about like that kind of a thing. But now I think with like technology and how we're better able to see in like, in lower light levels, now I think what cinematographers tend to do and what directors prefer also, and I'm sure the actors do too, it's like you light the space like a room, and then you let the actors like kind of explore it as they wish to explore it. So I think that's kind of how like cinematography's kind of changed a little bit. I mean, not necessarily, because there's some shots where you need the like actor in a very specific spot for a very specific reason, but just like broader strokes, I think that's kind of how it is. So if we want to move ahead to the next
I guess
slide.
I'm just wondering if let's talk through this and then we can like sort of go through the images.
Yeah.
I think it's been a bit of a while, so I don't want to.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We're reaching a while.
No, that's cool.
Okay. So there's there's three types of lighting: low key, normal, and high key. So I think it's like in relationship between the background and the subject. So if the background is darker than the subject, you'd call that low key lighting. If the background's brighter than the subject, you call that high key lighting. And we'll see three examples really quickly of that.
I think this was super interesting just to have it articulated, because I think this is something you see, in almost every film.
Yeah.
And then, but sort of knowing what that vocabulary is just adds. I feel it just like adds a different element, because like now you can sort of see like the films that you watch going forward. I haven't seen a film since we talked about it, but like that's something that just like you have that ability to know and like differentiate. Like, oh, cool, this is the choice, and then it sort of like helps reinforce whatever was driving that decision.
Yeah, exactly. So this is from The Godfather. So this is low-key lighting. As you can see, he's kind of separated from the background because the light's really just hitting him, and none of the light's really hitting the background at all, right? And so that's kind of like a good example of low-key lighting. Leads to like very dramatic images. But you'll see with the example that I've chosen for the high-key lighting, it doesn't mean that high-key lighting isn't dramatic. I think it's just dramatic in a different way. So I think the next shot's just like, kind of normal day exterior, cloudy skies, overall the exposure is pretty much in a very similar space. So, I mean, yeah, the background's a bit brighter than the foreground, but I think I would still classify this under like a very, pretty even lighting conditions, very normal. Because the next example, which is like what I very blatantly call high key lighting, is like an example.
It's incredible. Right, I'm gonna go next.
So yeah. So this kind of gives you like that sense of like, your eyes immediately go to the center of the image, and it's not like I said, it's not dramatic. It's very dramatic, but I think in a very different way. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and I think it's also like, I mean, I haven't seen this film, but it's definitely by design, right? The black chair in a white table, and then
yeah,
the hint of red. Just a very like, it's a very like, it, this image just catches your attention, you know.
absolutely.
So I think that's just like important to think about. And now silhouettes. So like obviously with silhouettes, the light is going to come from behind the character and then like, you know, towards the camera, obviously, because you need to create separation between your background and the foreground elements. So I think, I mean, we can kind of go through these relatively quickly, but
Yeah, just
I think it's like a very like, you know, often used
cinema,
tool in
for
cinematography.
example.
Um, this next shot kind of shows you like a low contrast image, and like cinematographers often will use like, depending on what mood they want to evoke, like, you know, this is a period film, so you know oftentimes you'll see with period films they'll use a lower contrast look, kind of to create that sense of
Yeah,
datedness, and obviously then there's like the rain element which adds to that lower contrast, and the cloud, like the fog or the cloudiness of it. So all these elements kind of play together to kind of create that low contrast image. Not to say it's not dramatic, but I think it's just very it's just a choice that's been made.
yeah. I mean, I think it's similar just to what you were saying earlier. It's just dramatic in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of conveys a different emotion. You know.
Yeah, we can go to the next slide. So this is about lighting direction. And so this is like an important thing to consider. So if you have your camera here and your subject, you kind of want to keep your light not on the same side as the camera. You want your light to come from the opposite side. And I think what that allows you to do, I mean, it's not, once again, not wrong or right, but I think what it allows it to do is like, it allows the camera to see a side of a face or a side of a subject in shadow. So it creates a certain 3D um, aspect to your characters. So for
Right.
example, with this, like you can see the light is coming from like the top left corner and hitting the side of his face and barely even coming around to the left side of his face.
Yeah,
Um,
and then this next one's sort of similar, but just a
yeah,
bit different.
yeah. This is a little more like, I mean, I would say like, you know, the first one was like if the light was like, say, you know, very like flat to him, but this one is like a little more frontal.
Yeah,
Um, and I think it does the same thing. You know, there's a side that has a certain brighter spot, and there's a side that has a little more shadow. And I think it does a good job of kind of sculpting the face and kind of creating something that's just visually more aesthetic and interesting to look at.
yeah,
Um, and then, you know, 12 Angry Men, you know, each of these characters are essentially in the same room, but they none of them have flatter like a flat light on their face, you know, and I think that's really fascinating. I think it's, you know, each one has a little bit of, you know, contrast. There's a brighter spot, there's a darker spot to their, like, you know, the way their face appears on the screen. So yeah, and now,
this one.
yeah, so this is talking about color, and this is color by design.